It's been a particularly challenging year for the global economy. There have been concerns about growth. There have been concerns on so many grounds, for example, extreme weather conditions and uncertain future. But there are prospects of hope, certain areas of the global economy which are showing a great deal of promise. But there are other larger global concerns as well. To talk about some of these, I'm joined by Gita Gopinath, Deputy Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund. Thank you very much, Gita, for chatting with us today. First off, the big story, of course, around the world is the war, Israel versus Hamas. It's a huge humanitarian crisis. At what stage does this potentially become an economic crisis, perhaps across the world?
Hi, Vishnu. It is really heartbreaking to see what is happening there in terms of the loss of innocent civilian lives. It's terrible. In terms of economic consequences for the rest of the world, a lot depends upon how this conflict changes over time. So if it becomes a much more regional conflict, then it can have very important consequences. So if I were to point to one, it would be on the effect on oil prices. Our estimate is that if you have a 10% increase in oil prices, then that reduces world GDP by about 0.15 percentage point. It raises inflation by 0.4 percentage point. And given that many countries in the world are still trying to bring inflation down, that will add to their challenges. But in addition to that, of course, there are migration issues. There's what could be the effect on tourism on countries in the region. I think it's too early at this point to know what may happen. We're watching the events very closely.
It is interesting that you talk about fuel. Is that an immediate area of concern for you in terms of a possible volatility in fuel prices?
We are concerned about volatility in fuel prices. We've seen actually gas prices go up quite a bit in Europe because of damage to a particular gas pipeline. Like I said, I think the big concern is countries are fighting inflation. Headline inflation was coming down for many countries. If it goes back up in an environment where you've had high inflation for a while, that can set into inflation expectations and then make it harder for central banks to win the fight against inflation.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about India and our economic growth. If you look at the report, the annual report, it's 6.3%. That's up 0.2%. Is India on course to, in your assessment, to becoming the third largest economy in the world by 2030? I mean, that's what the rhetoric is. I just wanted to understand from an economist.
So first, I think it's absolutely the case that India has strong growth. At 6.3%, it's one of the largest growth numbers that we have among major economies. We have 6.3% for this year and 6.3% for next year. We did the upgrade because the first quarter data came in somewhat stronger than we had expected. And if there is this continuing amount of public investment that happens, that seems to be catalyzing private investment, and consumption is holding up better than we expected. So I think those are good signs. In terms of the trillion-dollar number that India gets to, I'm always a bit cautious about it because, as we know, the last 3 years we had the pandemic, we had Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So it seems, I wouldn't want to venture into talking about particular dates by when those numbers can be reached. I think the important thing is India is doing well. The economy is strong. There is macro stability, and we see inflation coming into the RBI's target band. Yeah. The financial sector is the strongest it's been in a long time. I think all of these are very helpful, and if you combine that with structural reforms, which are still needed, a lot of which is still needed, that can generate a lot of growth in India.
The report has also spoken about China and certain headwinds which exist. There's been mention of the real estate sector, I believe, in China, which continues to lag. China not quite out of the pandemic concerns with regard to growth. If you look at global growth, and certainly growth in Asia, how much of a factor is China right now in sort of bringing down expectations?
So we downgraded China slightly from 5.2 to 5 for this year. I mean, we see growth slowing down in China in the coming years. The property sector is right now an important concern. We saw some improvement in the first half of this year, but then we're seeing again deterioration. It is a risk, especially if it spills over into the financial sector. But more generally, China has an aging population, weaker productivity growth. In terms of spillovers to Asia as a whole, the estimate we have is that when China's growth goes down by about 1 percentage point, it shaves off about 0.3 percentage points out of growth over a 5-year period for Asian regions. If I looked at India specifically, I don't see strong direct spillovers. I mean, if you look at the trade or the financial linkages, we don't expect to have a big effect of India slowing down. But if there is a more general slowdown in the global economy that comes from Asia slowing down, of course, that will feed into growth for India.
Perhaps the biggest concern is that the overall global outlook for 2023 is 3.4%. In other words, well below, significantly below the pre-pandemic projections, right? And you've also spoken about a whole lot of factors which are affecting this. Could you outline some of those factors?
So growth for 23, global growth for 2023 is 3%. We have it going down slightly to 2.9, but the main news is that it stays at around 3% in the next few years, which is well below what it used to be a couple of decades ago, which was around 3.8%. Among the major factors is globally aging demographics and weakening productivity growth. And if I did this country by country, China, for instance, is one country whose the fact that we've downgraded its growth over the next few years does play an important role.
Yeah. What about food insecurity linked to the Ukraine-Russia war? That war isn't ending at all. It's one of the concerns which you've raised. How does that continue to affect growth as you look at it?
Food insecurity is a major concern. It obviously affects countries, especially for low-income countries who spend a big chunk of their consumption basket on food. For them, these higher food prices, even though food prices have come down some since their absolute peaks, but they're still quite high. And so, it's making life very difficult for them. We're seeing many more enter into high levels of food insecurity. That is a concern, and among the things that we've done at the IMF is we created a new financing facility. It was called the food shock window, so that we could disperse quickly to countries that were in need.
Yeah. Almost every second or third session over here at the annual meet in Marrakesh has some sort of reference, either indirect or direct, to climate. Extreme weather, extreme events have been a major concern, and I know it is a very major concern of the IMF as well. Are you able to share any direct correlation between where we are economically and extreme weather events?
We are seeing an increase in the frequency of such extreme climate-related disasters, and the economic cost of that is adding up. Now, it does depend on which part of the world that you live in, and sometimes it's very concentrated. The effect can be very strong. The implications for global growth right now are still small numbers, just because the larger economies are, they're getting hit by some shocks, but otherwise they're doing okay. But for individual countries, small island nations, this can be very, very big. I mean, even in India has, temperatures are going up in India at twice the rate that it's happening on average in the world. So it is quite vulnerable.
Yeah. One of the reports that India is actually releasing over here, not India, but Larry Summer and N.K. Singh, is on reform of multilateral development banks. It's a two-part report, part 2 released over here, but the target is $390 billion, which needs to be made available. In other words, a tripling of funds. Do you believe that this is realistic? And if so, what would it help achieve?
So, their headline number is that emerging and developing economies will require about $3 trillion a year to meet their sustainable development goals and the climate transition. That is a whole lot of money. And the expectation is that about $1 trillion will come from multilateral development banks and $3 trillion have to come from domestic resources. It's absolutely the case. If you look at the spending needs, these countries will need a lot of financing in an environment where interest rates are actually high. We're no longer in that incredibly low interest rate environment that we were after the global financial crisis. There's been a huge discussion on reform of MDBs. India played a very important role through its G20 leadership in making that happen. I can see momentum on that front. The second leg, which is the domestic resource mobilization, which is helping countries raise the amount of tax revenue that's needed, expenditure efficiency. This is something that the G20 has entrusted to the IMF and the World Bank to take ahead, and we're doing that.
You've spoken over here about about growth in Africa and development in Africa. We are, of course, in Africa, and I think it's wonderful that Morocco has agreed to sort of go ahead and despite the earthquake and the impact, to go ahead with this meet. That said, India and the G20 process really pushed for inclusion of Africa. So the African Union is part of the G20 process. How is financial inclusion of Africa a key theme and a key part of what the IMF and the World Bank have focused on over here?
I mean, for the world as a whole, the African continent is incredibly important, because if you start looking over the next many years where most of the working age population will come from, that is on the African continent. And so it is very important to make sure that, first of all, there's enough jobs that are coming up in line with the increase in the size of the working age population. One of the things on which we made progress is for the IMF governance was to include a third chair for Africa. Specifically, it would be from sub-Saharan Africa, and that increases their voice on the global stage. And again, as you said, I think one of India's achievements through the G20 was bringing the African Union in as a permanent member of the G20. So it's going to be very important. It's a difficult time. We're not seeing a whole lot of capital flow going into Africa. A whole lot of structural reforms will be needed. They need regional trade integration. Initial steps have been taken, but a lot more needs to be done.
Yeah. Again, something that India has pushed very heavily is digitalization. There's, of course, the technology back end to that, but also the experience associated with that. Do you believe that model, both from a policy and technology standpoint, can be adopted by other nations? And if so, how?
India is a leader in this field, and I can see other countries looking to India, seeing how to design their digital public infrastructure and learn from the lessons of India. I think India did several things right, because the government provided the basic fundamentals that are needed for a digital environment, including identity, data, payments, and they kept it open-ended. So open access, they kept it open access so that you could build on top of it. And so you have a lot more innovation that's going on. Now, how countries use it is going to depend on their country's specific circumstances, but this basic idea of the government providing the rails of the digital economy and keeping it accessible to everybody is very helpful.
Yeah. Just one or two questions more. AI has been one of the big buzz points, in any conversation. There's a great deal of potential over there. There's a great deal of concern there as well. How does the IMF assess the potential of artificial intelligence and economic growth?
Yeah. Again, very early days. We started out, Vishnu, by talking about the weak growth prospects of 3% that we're looking at for the global economy. One area where we think, well, maybe here's a possible solution that can raise productivity, and that is the promise of AI, especially the new kind of generative artificial intelligence. Yeah. But it's far from certain at this point whether we're going to get all that productivity gain. I think we should, obviously the innovation is important, but it's going to require regulation, and this is not business as usual. This is a very different animal that we have to deal with in terms of regulation. Just make sure that this AI is used so that it actually benefits humanity. And also you need to take into account that there's going to be a lot of workers who may be affected directly by this and may be substituted out, may lose jobs. Governments will need plans in place to make sure that there is a way for them to continue to be in the labor force.
Global regulation, that's what you're talking about as being absolutely important and imperative. You don't believe that AI necessarily might result in massive layoffs in different sectors around the world?
So what we've seen traditionally with technology, and that happens every single time there's been a technological development, is this concern that it will end up with a whole lot of layoffs and it doesn't really help create jobs. And what history has taught us is that on net, a lot more jobs are created. Now, they're in different sectors, they demand different kinds of skills, and so there are people who get affected by it and who lose jobs. But that's where policy plays a role in making sure that they get the right support that they need. Yeah. In the case of AI, it could be very different. It's very interesting, the early studies that are coming up, which is, in the past, being a new entrant to a particular industry what meant that you didn't have the experience, you had to wait to learn,
Yeah.
and therefore your pay you got was not as big.
Right.
But with AI, you get to use all the experience that others had, and you get that information very quickly.
Yeah.
So we could see somewhat more of a flattening of the pay structure.
Sure. Gita, wonderful speaking to you. Thank you so much indeed. Gita Gopinath, talking about everything from artificial intelligence to, of course, concerns in West Asia at this stage, the possibility of fuel prices being volatile in the interim period, climate events, greater financial inclusion. It's all been discussed over here at the annual meet of the IMF and the World Bank in Marrakesh, Morocco.